Rome, the Central Forum, circa 150 BC. A messenger enters Rome and approaches the Senate building. The letter reaches the hands of Cato the censor. It's news regarding events in Africa. Nothing involving Rome itself. Cato reads it. A smile appears on his face. He has everything he needs to right Carthage's death wars. Hello! Welcome back to Second-Hand History, and part 2 of our series on Scipio Nasica's opposition to the Third Punic War. Where we last left off, Nasica had taken a stand against a growing movement led by Cato the censor to wipe Carthage off the map. The former argued that Rome needed Carthage as a counterweight to maintain civic discipline, and perhaps more persuasively, that Carthage hadn't done anything wrong to justify war. For months, or maybe even years, these arguments kept the pro-war faction at bay. But Cato's side wasn't about to give up. All they needed, after all, was a pretense. And for that, they looked to an old friend of Rome's, Massinissa, king of Numidia. A wily old man, Massinissa had actually fought in the Second Punic War on Carthage's side, but he defected when the tide turned. Afterwards, Rome rewarded him by giving him full power over the previously divided Numidians, who he proceeded to transform from a nation of nomadic herders to a settled agricultural society. The contemporary Greek historian Polybius praised him as a forward-thinking leader who brought civilization to his subjects, but the man had further ambitions. Over the years, he repeatedly raided Carthage's remaining land. Part of the surrender terms from the prior war said that Carthage couldn't take arms without Rome's permission, so Carthage would dutifully appeal to its old enemy for mediation. Like clockwork, Rome would send an envoy, rule in Massinissa's favor, and leave. For years, Carthage put up with this. Lately, though, the raids were getting bolder. Carthage undertook defensive preparations. It was this sort of situation that could give Cato the pretense for a Third Punic War. Nasica was also watching events unfold in Africa. Dispatched by the Senate in 152 BC as the latest mediator, he commanded the Carthaginians to partially disarm. He wasn't that pro-Carthage. But unlike those before him, he also convinced Massinissa to withdraw. Not long afterwards, Carthage paid its final indemnity. Maybe, just maybe, everyone could finally turn the page on the last war. Satisfied, Scipio Nasica returned to Rome, and the Senate later dispatched him to investigate unrest in Macedon, where a man pretending to be the son of the former king had incited a revolt. And then the next year, Massinissa changed his mind and attacked Carthage again. Staying true to his word wasn't exactly how he became king of Numidia, after all. Fed up, the Carthaginians raised an army to confront him. They got absolutely clobbered, but just like that, Numidia was now the least of their problems. In trying to actively defend itself without Rome's permission, Carthage had technically violated their old surrender terms. To a modern ear, and even to many contemporary Greeks, this may have sounded a little flimsy given what was to come, but it was all Cato needed. Rome had its pretense. The Carthaginians had not merely attacked Numidia, Cato told listeners. It was a dress rehearsal for their ultimate plan to rise up against Rome. His rival Scipio Nasica wasn't even there to rebut him. Panicking, Carthage crucified the commanders they sent against Numidia and frantically dispatched emissaries to Rome, but it was too late. When asked what would assuage Rome's anger, the Senate demanded the Carthaginians to abandon their city and move inland. This was too much. Carthage refused, and in 149 BC, the Third Punic War began. For 3 years, Carthage valiantly held out against the Romans, but in 146 BC, their defenses cracked. Led by Nasica's relative, Scipio Aemilianus, the Romans burned Carthage to the ground and slaughtered or enslaved everyone inside. Only ruins remained. A century would pass before anyone resettled there. In Rome, life went on. Cato had already died of old age. Scipio Nasica followed several years later. But over the following decades, Nasica's warnings seemed to come true. Corruption exploded. Vast slave-run estates gobbled up small farms whose former owners flocked to the cities and formed a new underclass. Rome traditionally expected its soldiers to supply their own gear, but by the 1st century BC, so few male citizens were able and willing to do so that rich generals funded their own armies, which they could then turn against their political enemies and each other. It was a recipe for crisis. Rome fell into a prolonged period of civil war and instability, culminating in the Republic's demise and its replacement by the Empire. Some later writers, notably St. Augustine, would portray Scipio Nasica as a prophetic voice of virtue and restraint. Recent scholarship has moved away from interpreting history as a question of virtue, but if I may give my opinion, Scipio Nasica's warning was still meaningful, just not in the way he intended. The problem wasn't Rome's morals, but a deeper contradiction between Roman expansionism and its ability to function as a republic. The more Rome expanded outside of Italy, the more imperial expediency or just plain greed replaced questions of right and wrong. The Senate neither had the ability nor increasingly the will to rein in unscrupulous provincial governors. Meanwhile, it became harder and harder for its citizen soldiers to sustain themselves between far-flung campaigns, while the riches of conquest only fueled the vast estates that displaced many of them. All the while, the Republic's leaders were highly reluctant to consider measures that might have at least partially helped matters, like land reform or extending citizenship to non-Roman Italian subjects. Would-be reformers were demonized or outright killed, and when their ideas eventually were implemented out of necessity, it was too little, too late. Rome had never been an egalitarian society, but the shifts were too much for the system to bear. No wonder ordinary plebeians lost faith in it and grew open to strongmen like Caesar. In short, the danger of destroying Carthage was not losing a, quote, counterweight of fear, but rather that it represented an inflection point in the Republic's increasingly aggressive foreign policy that was slowly destroying its—
Whoa, hold on!
Wait, since when did you have a voice?
Since now! Firstly, you know that a few historians argue that Scipio Nasica's warning was an embellishment made up by later authors, right? He might have never even touched on that point.
Well, yes, but most sources in our research accepted it as likely or were at least open to it being one of his arguments.
You still should have at least touched on it as a matter of good historiographical practice, especially if you are going to use it as a segue into a matter as large as the fall of the Roman Republic. If you're going to make grand, sweeping statements like you just did, you also need to acknowledge alternative interpretations as well as evidence to address how they do or don't fit with yours. For example, what about the Servile Wars?
Oh, come on, this is a YouTube video, not a dissertation.
Sorry, that's not how it works anymore. Good history is not just a matter of telling a fun narrative. You also have to address alternative explanations, their evidence, your evidence countering their evidence, and so forth. Otherwise, you're just participating in the myth-making process so prevalent in popular—
Hold on, viewers, just a second. Thank you for watching today's video. Please like and subscribe, and hope to see you next time.